Right. Today we're going to talk about modifying one of these learning resources answer buzzers into a switch to use with switch adapted toys. This little bubble blower has been switch adapted. We can plug that in and then this button will operate. It should have received an answer buzzer, the plug. Along with the plug, there's a large piece of heat shrink and a small piece of heat shrink and some wire. It's about 3 feet long or so, and it's got 2 conductors in it. Alright, we're going to take the wire and we're going to strip the insulation off of it back about 1 inch. And I just lightly put it in the crimpers and kind of rotate it. No, not crimpers, the wire cutters, strippers. Alright, and that kind of marks the insulation there a bit, and you can kind of pull it off now. Inside you'll see a black wire and a red wire, and then there's like a string in there. We can trim that string off just like that. On the red wire, I'm going to strip back, and this is 24 gauge wire, so use the 24. I'm going to strip back about, maybe 1/4 inch or so. There you go. And then I'm going to twist it to where the strands are nice and tight with each other. Then I'm going to put it in our handy little vise here. They're called helping hands. And now I'm going to do what's called tinning the wire. I'm just going to heat it up and put a little bit of solder on it. You want to kind of clean your solder tip so that it's kind of doesn't have any dark spots. It's kind of shiny. Then touch the tip with solder and make it even shinier there, and it helps to transfer the heat to the wire, to have a little bit of solder on it. And just a tiny bit of solder on it. You don't want much, because it's going to have to be soldered into a hole. So if you get too much, like there's a big old glob on it, just kind of heat it up and kind of flip it off, kind of like that, until you just have a nice small amount. Doesn't really increase the diameter of the wire any. Right, now take your small piece of heat shrink, and I like to trim it off a bit, just about in half. And you're going to slide that up on that red wire. Then take your pliers and bend you a hook in the end of that wire. It'll look about like that. Alright, take your plug and unscrew the plastic cover, and you'll notice there's a little tab, this little short one sticking out here. It's got a hole through the center of it. You want to take that red wire and hook it through that hole, and then take your pliers and crimp it down just like that. Put it in your clamp and then solder it. Make sure your heat shrink is back away from it. Or it'll start trying to shrink on you. Right, then slide your heat shrink up over the where you soldered, and take your heat gun and shrink the heat shrink. Right, now take your black wire and you'll see there's a hole in the back of the long piece. You're going to want to cut your black wire to where it's about maybe an 1/8 inch longer than where that hole is. So I'm just going to trim that off. And then you want to strip about 1/4 inch off that wire of the insulation. So it's 24 gauge again. I'm going to strip that off. I'm going to twist those fibers together. And then you want to poke the wire through that hole. And then slide it out to where everything's about even. Well, there we go. Okay, now you can see I have the wire sticking out of the hole there. I want to solder that. And it's going to take you some heat. You're going to have to hold it on there a second or two to kind of heat it up and make sure it kind of spreads out and adheres to that big wide metal piece there. Just like that. Okay, now take your pliers and on the front of that long metal piece, there's some tabs that are sticking up. We're going to kind of crimp those down over the wire. Not real tight, but just enough to kind of hold it. Just like that. And then take your large piece of heat shrink and slide it all the way down the wire and up on the connector like that. And then use your heat gun. To shrink the heat shrink down on it. Now you want to take your cover that you unscrewed off of it and slide it all the way up the wire and screw it back onto the plug. And that completes that end of the wire. Alright, now the other end of that wire, you want to also strip off about 1 inch or so of the insulation, just like you did before. And trim off the string that's in there. And then strip back about 1/8 inch or so of the black wire and the red wire. Like that. Again, kind of twist them together so they're nice and tight. Alright, the first thing you'll do is take one of the buzzers, flip it over, and on the bottom there are 4 rubber feet. You want to take something like a small screwdriver. I'm using a small knife here, and you'll pop those feet off. I usually just stick them down right next to where they go. We're trying to expose these screws that are underneath them so that we can take the switch apart. So there's your 4 screws that we're going to take out. You don't need to open up the battery compartment. We're not going to utilize the battery. Now you want to pull the 4 screws out. And that gets you to the insides of the toy. You've got your button assembly, your ring, and then the electronics. And get all 4 of these screws out. There we go. Now I want to point out right here, there's a little hole labeled VDD on the board. We're going to solder a wire to it, and then down here there's a row of 4 pads. One of them has a device soldered to them. We're going to take a soldering iron and remove that, and then we're going to hook the second wire to this J4, J3, J2, J1 pads right here that are closest to the speaker on this side. Take your switch base with the electronics, and you'll notice there's a little notch in the edge right here. In the ring that goes around it, there's a little tab right there. When you reassemble, those go together. That orients the ring on the base. Now we're going to have to drill a hole for the wire to go out, and we want it right down here by the speaker. So we're going to drill a hole right here where my thumb is. And if you'll notice, there's like a large flat base or flat area at the base where the base of the electronics module goes in. There's a flat area in the middle and then a curved area at the top. We want to drill that hole right there in the middle of that flat area, in the middle. I'm using an 1/8 inch drill bit, a 1/8. Don't drill into your finger. So there you go, I've drilled a 1/8 inch hole. Alright, now you want to take your wire that you stripped back here previously, and you want to feed it from the outside through that hole and pull yourself a good bit and to the bottom of the ring. Okay, now once again we're going to tin. I'm going to clean my soldering tip first. So now you can see it's kind of shiny. And we want to tin just the red wire, not the black wire. And I'm going to put a little solder on my tip. And there you go. Don't do the black wire at this point. We're going to take the black wire that we did not tin, and we're going to push it down in the VDD hole. Just like that, and then we're going to bend it down flat to the board, and then we're going to solder it. It's going to want to stay flat, but we'll get some solder on it and then push it down. You can kind of hold it down a bit with the soldering iron too. It's going to take some heat to get this to flow down in there right. Just like that. Right, before we solder the red wire down, over here where these 4 pads are, where J4, J2, J3, J1 are, one of those 4, and it's different on different buzzers because these control what sound the buzzer makes. There's going to be a little 0 ohm resistor. We want to remove that, and the way you do that is you set your soldering iron next to it, melt the solder, and kind of pop it off, and you can see it there on the tip of the soldering iron. It's a tiny little thing. So take that off. Now we're going to solder the red wire to that front row, the row that's right there by J4, J3, J2, the row that's closest to the speaker there. And we're going to solder it down there. And since you tinned it and the pads have solder on them already, you shouldn't need any extra solder. It'll just solder right down if you just lay the wire on top and heat it up. Just like that. And kind of, once again, tug on it. Make sure it doesn't pop loose. So, there's your wires all hooked up. Your black wire is back here in the hole on VDD, and your red wire is up here on that front row, the J4, J3 row. Make sure that your wire is not in the way of the button here. We're now ready to reassemble the switch. So remember the little tabs on the back. There's also some tabs on the button. There's one on each side. Not real obvious, but there is a little indentation. And down in here there's a little bump that indentation goes over. So get it down past the wire there. And line up those little notches just like that, and then put your back on and line up the notch with the little hole. Alright. At this point, holding the back, you might press the front and make sure it clicks. Now you can start putting your screws back in. I usually try to get 2 across from each other in first, because that kind of holds the button together while you're putting the last 2 in. These tiny little screws can be difficult at times. It's also difficult to do with the camera right in your face. There we go. Then put your rubber feet back over the screws. And there you go. Alright, to test your button, some of the kits come with a tap light tester. You can plug into it and push your button and it lights up. If you don't have one of those, you can take the toy that you modified and plug into it. And test it that way.